Well, good afternoon, everyone. So hopefully I can keep your attention just for a little bit. I know this is a class to talk about leadership, but what I'm going to do is tell you about myself and then explain how that has to do with leadership. So I wanted to be a police officer since I was 7 years old. And my father wanted me to be an attorney. So the conversation was always back and forth, one or the other. But then at the age of 14, I became pregnant. And I had a child at the age of 15. And it kind of halted everything that I wanted to do. I didn't think I could ever be a police officer because of the situation I got myself into. I had to drop out of, I finished junior high, dropped out at 9th grade, finished the 9th grade, but never went to 10th or high school. Was on public assistance for a long time. And it taught me a lot of lessons. As I grew older, I knew my priority had to be taking care of my child. So I ended up working in the onion fields, which is extremely difficult work. It's very hard. So whenever you hear about migrant workers and whenever you're eating the vegetables that you eat, remember about those people, because that is it's the hardest job I've ever had. And it didn't pay well, but it paid enough to put food on the table. So as I grew up, and I wasn't old enough to drive then, wasn't old enough to get a job. Once I was old enough, I got a job at Hill Air Force Base. And I started out on the yard crew, is what they called it back then. I'm sure it's changed to some fancy name, working it on the grounds. It's like a groundskeeper. But I learned how to drive a garbage truck back then. Back in the day, the garbage truck folks actually had to pick up the cans and put them in the truck. So everything's automated now. But I had that opportunity to learn how to lay sod, plant gardens, mow lawns, pick up garbage. That's what you do when you want to support your family. And along the way, there was a worker program. And I decided to try for, put in an application, and I was selected for this workers program. And it was to teach me how to become an electrician on the F-16s. And that's what I eventually did. I was an electrician on the F-16s. I went through all of the training that needed to be done. And when I turned 31 years old, I realized that I still wanted to be a police officer. I wasn't doing what I wanted to do. I was doing what I had to support a family. But at the time I was married, and I was able to make a decision of what path I wanted to take. So when you're making those decisions on what path you want, doesn't necessarily mean you have to choose now, because you might change your mind along the way. And so I decided I was going to go to the police academy at the age of 31, which is actually quite old for most people that go through the academy. Usually you're 21. So it was a challenge, but I made it through, and that was 29 years ago. Since then, I started out at Weber State College, working as a police officer, doing more campus security. That was my first year. My second year, I got hired by Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office. And since that time, I've been working as a police officer. I've worked in many different job assignments, from patrol officer to community policing officer, to detectives, Metro Gang Unit, narcotics units, fraud units, sexual assault, domestic violence. So I've had a great opportunity throughout the years to do what I really wanted to do, because the reason I wanted to be a police officer is I wanted to help people. And that was what You know, most people that go into law enforcement say they want to help people. It's changed a little bit now. Some people say they want to because they want a check. And those are the folks that we probably don't want in law enforcement. If you're only coming to law enforcement because you want a paycheck, you have to have a passion about helping people. When you become a law enforcement officer, you on a daily basis will see people at the lowest time of their lives. When you have to make an arrest, when you go on a car accident, when you go on a death, it is the lowest part of someone's life, and the impact that law enforcement has on individuals you interact with on a daily basis is huge. And that's why it's so important who we choose for law enforcement, who we accept the application, and then as they go through the academy, we have to be very particular who we choose because it's so important. You can leave a lasting impact on someone forever. And an example for me was in the late 90s, I had never done a death notification before. And I had a captain that said the next death, you get to go do that because at some point in your career, you have to give those notifications. And we had two individuals who were up in the canyon, and they had just gone up there to take photos. The moon was beautiful that night, and they went up there, and an individual who thought it was entertaining to him to see how it would feel to kill someone went up there and shot both of them, killing the male, and the female actually survived. But I had to go give the death notification to the parents. And at the time, we didn't have the suspect in custody. It was probably one of the hardest days of my life, but also the hardest day of their life. And that's why I say it really matters who wears a uniform. Years later, there is now a podcast on that same homicide case. And I was driving down the road one day, just listening to podcasts, and that one came up, and I heard the mother say, the day the officers came into my house and gave me the notification changed my life forever. Well, it's been over 20 years since I even thought about that interaction because I've had so many other death notifications I've had to give that it just brought me right back. That how important it is, how we handle ourselves, what we say to people when we're interacting, whether it's we're giving you a ticket or whether we are giving death notifications and all the in between. So with that, I decided in, 5 years ago that I wanted to run for sheriff. And because I had worked my way up through every single rank in law enforcement, and it's not easy. It's a male-dominated field. It's very difficult for females, but we're making it better. And we want to, right now, we're encouraging more and more females to come into the profession because we find that we have a lot to offer. Compassion and empathy is probably the two main things. So I decided to run for sheriff 5 years ago, and by becoming the sheriff, the responsibilities went from just I was a police chief out in Riverton, operating 26 officers, not a big precinct, to the largest police agency in the county. I now oversee the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office, which is the jail. We have the largest jail in the state of Utah, and we also have the largest court security in the state of Utah. And then I'm also the CEO of the Unified Police Department. So we have 1,980 employees. Some are law enforcement and some are civilian. And we have a great organization. It's just really challenging, especially when you think about going through the last 5 years when I became the sheriff. We have gone through so many different things. We had an earthquake, you have a pandemic that we had never seen before. We had social unrest, people who do not like law enforcement. It's hard to deal with those kind of situations, but we're making a comeback. And one thing that I can say is we've learned from those experiences how difficult it is to be a police officer, but also some things that we needed to change to make society better for everybody. And we're making those changes along the way. Even though it's a tough job, I can say that every day I come to work is the best day of my life because I absolutely love the job. And that's why I decided to run again, because I feel like I'm not ready to hang up my hat yet. At some point I will, because there's always going to be someone who can follow in your footsteps and make things even better than you left it. So that's where the leadership piece comes into play. So in law enforcement, one of the things that we teach for leadership is that you are always training the next person. There can't be any just holding everything to yourself, because it doesn't work. You have to be able to mentor. You have to be able to give support to people, just so if you think they're going to fill your shoes, you want the best to fill your shoes. Some of the things I learned along the way to become a good leader started when I was 14 years old. I was 14 years old on food stamps, embarrassed. People made fun of me. I saw people who were just cruel. I saw people who felt sorry for me, had empathy for me. And along the way, I realized that that's okay, because my experiences will help myself and others along the way, as long as I have compassion and empathy for people. And, you know, for years, law enforcement wasn't about compassion and empathy. It's about law and order. And it still is law and order. However, we can do it with compassion and empathy for everyone. And it has taught mainly our command staff that if we have compassion and empathy, not just for our public who we serve, but if you have it for your employees, you have a better workforce. So that's something that we push out a lot as leaders, is encouraging. It used to be a weakness if you had too much compassion for people, but it's not a weakness. It really is leadership when you have compassion and you're trying to help people along the way. It's super important to us as leaders of law enforcement to be able to stand together. We do know that it's tough when things get rough, that we still have to stand together. We know we're going to make mistakes along the way, but as long as you stand together and admit your mistakes and move forward, you can move the whole process forward, and your whole workforce will see a different view, because there's a lot of different challenges that we have in law enforcement. It's not just about budgets. I mean, I oversee a $200 million budget. It's hard to ask for more and more and more, but we do it. And sometimes you get your way and sometimes you don't, but it doesn't mean we give up. It means that we make the best with what we have. And I found that out early on as a teen mom. You make the best with what you have, and it'll still be okay. But that's what we do, is we try to reassure our employees, regardless of the outcomes of budgeting or policy or new legislation, will still be okay. And good leaders will ensure their folks that everything will still be okay. There are going to be challenges along the way, and you just have to realize you can make it through anything. And I can't tell you how many police officers have had so many challenges. Right now, we deal with one of the biggest issues with law enforcement is the mental health of law enforcement officers. Because as you go through careers, I have 29 years, I've seen a whole lot. And if you can't deal with those situations, you know, if you go on a death of a child, if you go on a car crash that's just super tragic, if somebody takes their life, or you see a violent homicide, those kind of things are tough. If you have to take a life, it's tough to deal with. And right now, that's what we're pushing is wellness for our officers so we can stay healthy to serve our communities. And the better that we are, the better our communities are. So I just want you to understand some of the things that law enforcement goes through right now. And also, if you think about what our communities go through, during the social unrest, our communities still haven't made it back to where we were prior. We still have people very fearful of what goes on in our communities. Even though there's been a lot of change, we still have a lot of fear, and we need to get past the fear. When you watch the news, they put a lot of fear in people. We try to do as many positive stories because there's a lot of good happening. And in law enforcement, there's a lot of good happening. Do want to talk a little bit about some of the jobs that you can see in law enforcement, because I think it's really important. Our biggest challenge right now is hiring and retaining officers. So we have corrections officers who work in the jail. We have corrections officers who do transport inmates back and forth to court. We have what's called MCERT teams. They're like a SWAT team, but it's in the jail. The jail hires at 19 years old. $25.93 an hour is starting pay. That will change come January because we're trying to ask for more money. It's a great career. We also have under the sheriff's office the bailiffs that work in the court system. There's court security, and they also do security in all the different county buildings. They start out the same pay, but you have to be 21 for that job. And then under Unified Police Department, in order to be a law enforcement certification, have a law enforcement certification, you have to be 21. You have to go through the police academy, which is different than a corrections academy. The police academy is a little bit longer, but those are the officers you see out in the street. They're, you know, taking initial reports, doing traffic. They're the investigators. They are detectives, they're school resource officers. They do all of that, but you can start at 21, and depending on what department you apply with, the wages range, but they're around that $25, $26, $28 an hour as well. So it pays pretty good. It's just a stressful job, and you have to know that going in, but it's probably going to be the best time of your life. Some of our detective jobs, we have domestic violence investigators, we have fraud investigators, we have forensics, we have narcotics that work with the DEA or neighborhood narcotics. We have what's called special units that go out and just address any issue that is in your community that patrol would address. Patrol, we have that as well. Patrol usually is responding to 911 calls, and then in their downtime they do proactive jobs. And then we have our sexual assault detectives, we have homicide detectives, we have cold case detectives. Cold case detectives, that's a real interesting job. We just solved a case that was back in 1957, the death of a baby. And, you know, I talked to the detective this morning, and he just, it's unbelievable he even solved it, but just the satisfaction and reward he got from finally finding justice for that baby is huge. And that's really when you become a detective, how you start to feel with each case. When you work in homicide cases, or even if you're working a runaway case or a missing person, we have a lot of human trafficking that goes on. So anytime we can get somebody back that has been trafficked, it's a huge reward. So I would encourage you all to take a look at maybe you having law enforcement as a career. When you work in the jail as a corrections officer, the reward there is you have the opportunity to engage with individuals who got themselves in trouble and ended up in jail. They haven't been convicted yet, but many times they suffer from mental health issues or substance disorder issues, and you get to help them along the way. And depending on the interaction you have, could change their mind in their criminal behavior, or sometimes they even confess to things, or they you find out they're a witness in another crime. It's very rewarding to work in there in the jail because you truly are helping individuals who are challenged in a sense that they're in jail and they're in custody. And it's not a great place to be. It's a hard place to be. But they're at their lowest there as well. And if you get to help them and they never come back, that's our goal, is that we have alternatives to incarceration for a reason, is we want to help these individuals so they will never come back. But at the same time, we want to ensure that we have beds available for all the violent offenders that need to be in jail. And that keeps our community safe. So, you know, I hope I've been able to kind of encourage some of you to take a look at law enforcement as a career. It's a great career and you won't regret it. But I'm here to answer any questions if you have any for me. Anybody? Come on. Somebody have one? There you go.
With all the hate towards police officers and sheriffs, how do you deal with that?
Well, it's tough. I mean, during the riots, that was probably the hardest part, especially for our officers of color, because they were on the front lines and they were getting assaulted and they were being called traitors by people in the crowd. And that was tough. We actually ended up bringing in some therapists to help the officers and talk them through it. But then when you take a look at on a daily basis, most people are supportive of law enforcement. Most people thank you. Even if you give a traffic ticket, you get thanked. So there's only a small amount of individuals who are negative towards law enforcement, but they get all the attention. So it is a challenge to get past that. But as a leader of the organization, people look at me of how I take it. So if I'm going to get really angry and we're going to take it out on our communities, people will follow me. If I'm going to say, look, there's the few that don't agree with us, we communicate how we operate and what we do, and you can explain all day to some people, they'll never accept it. But for the most part, our community is listening and we're trying to explain our position. And that is a huge challenge. And with recruiting, since 2020, we have had a huge challenge in recruiting people because they don't want to be part of that negativity, but it is changing. Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
We got one back there, so whoever wants to ask.
Oh, how do you deal with like your team or just you in general of like maybe the mental exhaustion of like all the traumatic events that you guys experience?
Well, we have what's called a wellness program, and we had to do this after 2020 because it was so mentally exhausting to everyone. So now we have a rest period. So if an officer, whether it's in the jail or out on the street, experiences a critical incident, they can go into this rest period, and we have rooms that they can go into and kind of decompress. What we didn't have prior to that was if you were an officer and you went on a traffic accident, say it had a death in it, as soon as you cleared that, you were on the road again, going to the next. It could be a domestic violence or a suicide or a baby death or It could be a good thing that you went out on, but it's nonstop. And now we're stopping and saying, are you okay? And can you take yourself out of the situation for just a little bit? And we're finding out that that is really helping. Because we know officers who don't get help, they cope differently through alcohol or drugs, or they take it out on their families, and that's the last thing that we want. So we have a really good, robust wellness program since 2020. And we have what's called peer support teams. Those are officers who have been involved in critical incidences that have been trained on how to deal with helping other officers through a mental issue if needed. And it really helps. I mean, we even give officers time to go work out because we know sometimes, getting in those physical workouts will help you decompress as well.
That was the question I had, we discussed out in the hall was maybe you can explain to why in Salt Lake County, your position is a elected position rather than an appointed position.
Sure. Yes, so sheriffs are a little bit different than police chiefs. Police chiefs are appointed by either their mayors, city managers, or their city councils. The sheriff is elected by the people. So the sheriff works for the people. They are not controlled by any other body. It's just we work for the people. And it's a huge difference because it becomes to where it's not so political when you're a sheriff versus a police chief. A police chief has to do what their mayor and county council want them to do or they don't have a job. With the sheriff, you have to do what's right or the people won't elect you again. That's how it works. And most sheriffs that I know take it very seriously, and they're really passionate about working for the people because it matters. You can't satisfy everybody and make everybody happy. We know that, but the majority of the people you have to think about, and it's about their public safety. And that's really what sheriffs are about, is preserving the public safety for everyone. It doesn't matter what you look like, where you come from. Everyone was treated fairly. Now, I'm not saying the police chiefs do it different. It's just that they are controlled by their government. And the sheriffs aren't. So that's a big difference. That's your question.
He does. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I know I liked what you talked about with leading with empathy and compassion first. And I know you talked about looking for certain qualities and hiring people to be on the force. What could you talk a little bit more about that? Like if you look at, I guess, as officers, as leaders within the community, and I guess
What we're looking for in someone that comes in and wants a job with us is somebody that recognizes that you have biases. We all have biases, but they're not racist. And believe me, sometimes we interview somebody and they flat out tell you how it is, and that's not the right person. Or they have a bias towards females, and they don't believe females should be in this profession. We get a lot of that still. Because sometimes when you take a look at how people are brought up, their upbringing does help contribute to certain biases. So here in Utah, when we were raised, women stayed home. They didn't work like we do now. So sometimes we even have officers who have been on 35 years that still believe that we should be at home. So we have to deal with that, but that's how you weed people out, by communicating to them. We have different type of tests that can identify it. A lot of it is our gut. We kind of can tell somebody, when they're lying. I mean, we're trained in that anyway. And that's what you really don't want is anyone that is good at lying, because we have to have the utmost integrity, and we have to be very transparent, and we live like in a bubble or glass building, you know, because everybody sees what we do now. There's a camera everywhere. You have to be really careful who you choose to wear the badge. Some of the things that we ask are different questions, and we can tell whether the person has empathy or compassion, or if they're going to just start crying, you know, and maybe they're a little too emotional to do this job. It just takes a group of trained, not just trained officers, our HR, our human resources. They participate in how we choose people. Some agencies do a psychological. Salt Lake City is still doing that, where they send you through a psychological test and it'll say whether or not they feel like you could handle this type of job. When I got hired, I had to go through a psychological. A lot of agencies are going away from that, but it's still something that helps us pick who we hire, and then we go through a very intense background. So your background's going to be checked from the time you were born all the way to whatever age you are. They're also going to check on your social media, your TikTok, your Twitters, everything. Years ago it was MySpace. They'll even go back to MySpace to see, just to see if there's racial tendencies by someone. If you posted something that was racial, we probably don't want you as a police officer. So, or if you know, were posing sexually, things like that, that was open to the public, those you would be questioned on. We do credit checks. We're looking for people who don't pay their bills, people who are in a lot of debt, because if you're in a lot of debt, I probably wouldn't put you in narcotics at all, because we give you money to use when you're working narcotics, to give to informants. And if you're in debt, you might be more willing to take that money for yourself. So we watch a lot of things like that. And if you've ever been committed, or if you've been convicted of a crime, marijuana use isn't the same as it used to be. When I got hired, if you had any, you probably would never be wearing a badge, but now it's changed. Depends on what kind of use it was, whether it was 2 years ago or 4 years ago. But the one key thing is you should never lie about it. Put everything down and let them weed it out, because how we end up terminating a lot of employees is we get them hired, and then down the road in their background, something came up. Or it could be an ex-spouse or ex, partner that came and said, hey, I just want to tell you about this. They really did use drugs, and then you go back and you find out that they lied. And if you lie, you're out. Post will not keep your certification if you lie. So, it's tough. It's tough to hire good people nowadays.
Yeah, good, thank you.
Anything else? Yes.
How do you deal with people that are like sexist or misogynistic?
Well, we have policies in place, lots of policies, and how we deal with it is if we get a complaint, say it's a sexual harassment complaint, we have procedures that we go through. And once you start making sure that you follow the policy and you do the investigation and you discipline people, they tend to not do that behavior anymore, and it does reflect on the whole organization. But every now and then we still have cases of sexual harassment, and it goes both ways. There's gender bias does happen, so sometimes it's just the opposite. People will think that most females are the ones that are sexually harassed, but we've had males who are sexually harassed as well. And You just have to deal with your employees and make sure that they're accountable. If you hold people accountable, they typically won't make that mistake again. And if they do, then you just terminate them. But for the most part, we're able to teach people, along the way, and they stay out of trouble. So that's one of the hardest jobs I have, is having to terminate people, especially when their dream was to be a police officer. But if you come in front of me and I find out that you lied and you're in the investigation or you didn't cooperate, you don't have a chance to stay, because we can't have officers who can't tell the truth.
Probably a touchy subject, but what sort of policies do you have regarding politics with your officers? For instance, I know during the civil unrest we had in summer 2020, I guess it was, I drove by my city hall and I saw unified police officers. I'm sorry, they weren't unified, they were the city police. And they were standing shoulder to shoulder with these Proud Boys or whatever. And the protesters across the street were like pregnant moms and people, with signs. And these armed civilians standing shoulder to shoulder with the police officers, and they all look like they're having a really good time. What sort of policy is there? What is that? Is that right?
Well, it depends on the situation. So some of the officers, because I know out here in Taylorsville that did occur, and that hit the media, that officers were engaging with the Proud Boys. Their explanation is they have to have that rapport with them to ensure that nobody is going to just, take things into their own hands. But when you watch the video, it was obvious that they have different political views than the group across the street, that weren't as liberal as a group across the street. And a lot of officers were disciplined for their behaviors, but we do have policies in place and we can't bring politics into the workforce. So, just because you're a Republican and you're a Democrat, I can't treat either one of you differently. We do try to control as much as we can on their social media. We have social media policies as well, but it's really hard to police that many police. So every now and then we will find one where somebody makes a complaint. Usually those officers are dealt with individually. And sometimes you can find that it's the whole department. The smaller agencies across the nation, you will find that they all have the same leadership, and they all have the same beliefs. And sometimes that is detrimental to the community, because if you can bring diversity in, you're going to have a much better department, because you have people coming from all over. People look different, they have different experiences. But if you just have those police officers all grew up together, all have the same beliefs, that's where the problems start. So, but yeah, I'm aware of some of those cases where officers were disciplined, and their reasoning was, well, we have to engage so we can monitor them closely, but the videos didn't match what they were saying. So, but that's why we have a very robust discipline process. And not everybody that gets disciplined gets fired. I would say it's just the opposite. We use discipline to teach people, and they learn from their mistakes, because everybody's going to make a mistake. You guys will make mistakes throughout your entire life. I do as a sheriff. We're not perfect people, but we do the best that we can do. And you have to understand that as a leader, you're going to have people who make mistakes, but you can't fire them all. You need workers. So the best thing is to teach them, and then things get better and better. And I know for the last 5 years, when I first became the sheriff, we had a stack this high of terminations that I had to go through. Weeding through it, and when you go through a termination, I like to see what started the process, what started the officer in getting in trouble. And when you start looking at it, you can see where supervisors didn't get a handle of it. They weren't there to help their people. And then it led to termination. And some of them, you would talk to other officers and they said, oh, I knew he was going to get in trouble eventually. I saw it coming. Well, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you do something? And now we encourage other officers, if you see your partner struggling, come see us. They're not going to get terminated. We're going to get them help. And that has really helped out a lot. So and that's a piece of leadership that many leaders still haven't recognized, that you got to help your people succeed or they won't. And if you can, you do everything you can to help them succeed. People invest a lot in a career, and to lose it because of one incident. Now, if it's a police officer that breaks the law, that's totally different. Like I said, why? But you know, maybe they're coming to work late. Then let's find out why. What's going on at home that creates that? Maybe they can't turn in their reports. Let's find out why. There's different things that you can do to help them and make them successful for the next 20 or 30 years. And that's really what we're trying to do. Anything else?
I've got maybe one other question, part is that, as you well know, we have an acute homeless population problem in the county and throughout our. What is the county mayor, what is she asking as far as help policing that segment of our population?
Well, for more funding for sure, for housing. We have a lot of unsheltered population in this county. And a lot of it falls on Salt Lake City because the majority are there. But we have the unsheltered folks that are across the board in the county. What the mayor has asked for is more funding for housing, more funding for temporary housing. And then what they do is abatements, and not everybody agrees with abatements. I have a hard time with abatements, but I know why it's done. So an abatement is when you have a large population, homeless population gathering in one area. They tend to move their garbage there. They tend to use a restroom there. It becomes very unsafe for the rest of the population, so they have to go in, clean it all up. They throw all of their stuff away. And the part I don't agree with is taking their belongings, because if you're homeless and your only belonging is a shopping cart full of stuff, that stuff is the most important thing in your life. And when you take that away, it creates more mental health issues for you. So the abatements have to happen, but doesn't mean I agree with it. But I don't have the solution. But I also know that we can't have these, you know, groups and crowds of homeless people in our parks, knowing that they're defecating all over the park, and we have our little kids coming through, and you know there's needles there. So there's a lot that has to be done. One thing that is interesting is in our jail. So our jail is at maximum capacity right now. There's a large portion that suffer from mental health issues or substance disorders. So that means they're addicted to drugs. And we can't keep arresting people and putting them in jail and do nothing with them. Because when they get out, the judge will let them out, then they come right back. It's just this revolving door. So what we've done is alternatives to incarceration, trying to get them treatment. We treat them in the jail for drug addiction, for alcoholism, and whatever we can do. And then the mental health piece, we have mental health therapists in the jail. We have a psychiatrist in the jail that can help them. And before they leave the jail, we offer all the resources available, whether it's housing, a job, school, Sometimes it's just to charge their phone or give them a pair of shoes. When people come to jail, they're not prepared. So some people come just in their underwear. They're just not prepared. And so when they get released, they're definitely not prepared to leave. And then they come back. So that's what we're trying to do, is find alternatives so they don't come back. But a large population in our jail are from the homeless population. Many of them have mental health issues. And jail does not help a mental health issue. It creates a bigger issue. And if you think about all of the homeless individuals, we just had a conversation this morning in my command meeting. Somebody was booked in jail. They are homeless. They have a dog. That dog meant the world to them. That dog ends up being taken to the shelter, and they were going to adopt it out immediately because they knew the person was homeless. But the person comes to jail and they can't pull themselves out of it. They're so depressed, so worried about their dog, that we actually had one of our civilian staff felt so bad for them. They went to the shelter and worked it out that the shelter kept that dog for that individual when they got bailed out. And that person was able to get back together with their dog. But just those little things matter, how you treat people. And if, we're trying to take a look at a program now, the majority of people who are booked in jail, you don't have opportunity to make plans, not for your kids, not for your dogs, not for any pets. If you have a senior at home, you don't get the choice. You go straight to jail. Well, we're trying to figure out how do we help them cope with all the issues that they left behind and help those individuals, because there have been people who were booked in jail and didn't tell us that they're elderly mothers at home and they can't even feed themselves. Well, days go by and then they finally tell you this person almost died. So we're trying to encourage them to give us all the information, even if it is a pet, it still matters. And that's kind of how we've evolved with law enforcement. More of, like I said, it's law and order. We want law and order, but at the same time, it has to be with compassion.